cop pulled a gun on Adam Schiff. 5 minutes later, he was the one arrested. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that blankets a lonely stretch of California highway and makes every sound sharper, more deliberate. Adam Schiff, a U.S. congressman from California, gripped the wheel of his dark sedan, his eyes fixed on the stretch of asphalt illuminated by his headlights. It had been a long day, committee hearings that dragged into overtime, classified briefings that weighed heavy on his mind, and the constant hum of decisions that shaped national security policy. Now, well past midnight, he was finally heading home from a late meeting in Sacramento, the road cutting through a quiet corner of the Central Valley where streetlights were sparse and the stars burned brighter than Los Angeles ever allowed. The hum of the engine was his only companion, a steady rhythm that matched the cadence of his thoughts about tomorrow's Intelligence Committee hearing. He wasn't speeding, 65 mm, right on the limit, his driving steady, his hands at 10 and 2. Years in public life had taught him discipline, precision, the kind of caution that kept you out of trouble. So when the sharp flash of red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror, his first reaction wasn't fear or guilt, but confusion. His brow furrowed, his gaze flicking to the speedometer, then back to the road. No mistakes, no infractions. He hadn't swerved, hadn't run a light. There was no reason for this. Yet the police cruiser behind him didn't waver, its siren cutting through the night like a blade. Schiff exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he signaled to the right, guiding his car onto the shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who knew the rules. He'd worked with law enforcement before, respected the job, understood the weight of a badge. This was routine, he told himself, just a quick check, a misunderstanding. But as the cruiser rolled to a stop behind him, its headlights bathing his car in harsh white glare, a prickle of unease settled in his chest. Something about the way the officer was taking his time, too long, too deliberate, felt off. Schiff adjusted his rearview mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of the man behind him. The cruiser's door finally creaked open, and out stepped Officer Daniel Torres, a figure cut sharp against the glow of the headlights. He wasn't tall, but his posture screamed authority, the kind that wasn't earned but demanded. His left hand rested on his belt, fingers brushing the holster of his firearm, while his right swung a flashlight back and forth, the beam slicing through the darkness. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached, each step measured, aggressive. Schiff lowered his window, keeping both hands visible on the wheel, palms upturned in a gesture of compliance. "Evening, officer," he said, his voice calm, steady, the same tone he used in committee hearings to diffuse tension. But Torres didn't return the greeting. He leaned down, his flashlight sweeping across Schiff's face, lingering too long, the beam blinding. "License and registration," he barked, his voice flat, chewing gum with a slow, deliberate rhythm that grated on Schiff's nerves. No explanation, no courtesy, just a demand. Schiff's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" he said, keeping his tone even, professional. Torres stopped chewing for a moment, his head tilting as if the question itself was an insult. "License, registration." The words were slower this time, each one clipped, a warning wrapped in them. Schiff held back a sigh. He'd seen men like this before. Small men with big egos, the kind who leaned on their badge to feel taller. But he wasn't here to argue, not yet. "All right, officer," he said, his voice still measured. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my jacket pocket." He moved slowly, deliberately, his right hand sliding toward his interior pocket, while his left stayed on the wheel. He pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his driver's license, and beside it, his congressional ID, the seal of the House of Representatives unmistakable even in the dim light. He held it out, expecting the officer's demeanor to shift, for recognition to soften the edge in the air. But Torres barely glanced at it, his eyes flicking to the ID, then back to Schiff's face, his expression unchanging, cold. "Congressman, huh?" he said, the word dripping with skepticism, as if it were a title Schiff had printed off the internet. Schiff nodded once, his patience thinning, but his composure intact. "Yes, sir. Now can you tell me why I'm being stopped?" Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the cruiser's engine. Torres chewed his gum again, his jaw working slowly, deliberately before he spoke. Step out of the vehicle. The words hit like a punch, not because they were loud, but because they were wrong. Schiff blinked, his mind racing to process the command. Excuse me, he said, his voice still calm but sharper now, a thread of steel running through it. Torres took a half step back, his right hand now hovering near his firearm, his left still gripping the flashlight. Step out of the car. The tension in the air thickened, pressing against Schiff's ribs like a physical weight. He'd been in high-stakes situations before, committee hearings where national security hung in the balance, public confrontations, even threats from those who didn't like his investigations. But this was different. This wasn't a debate. This was a man with a gun, a badge, and an attitude that screamed trouble. Schiff's pulse stayed steady, but his mind was already running through scenarios, calculating risks. He knew the protocol, knew his rights, but he also knew how fast things could spiral when a cop decided he didn't like you. Officer, I've complied with your requests, he said, his voice low, deliberate. I've shown you my identification. There's no reason for this. If there's an issue, let's call your supervisor. Torres's jaw flexed, irritation flashing across his face. I don't need a supervisor, he snapped, his voice rising just enough to betray his temper. I said get out. Schiff didn't move, not out of defiance but out of caution. His instincts, honed over years of navigating power dynamics and hostile witnesses, told him this wasn't about a traffic stop. This was about control, about a man who saw a challenge in Schiff's calm, in his title, in his refusal to cower. On what grounds, officer? Schiff asked, his tone unwavering, his eyes locked on Torres's. For the first time, the officer hesitated, his lips parting as if searching for a response. But instead of answering, he did something worse. He took a step closer, the flashlight dropping to his side, and his right hand unfastened the snap on his holster. The click was soft, but it echoed in Schiff's ears like a gunshot. I don't have to explain myself to you, Torres said, his voice low, dangerous. The air between them crackled, the weight of the moment pressing down hard. Schiff's heart beat steady, but his mind was a storm of calculations. He'd read the reports, seen the news. Stops like this going wrong, escalating in seconds, ending in tragedy. He wasn't naive. He knew the power a badge carried, and he knew the danger of a man who thought he was untouchable. You do, actually, Schiff said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. You're required to articulate a reason for this stop and for any further action. I'm a United States Congressman, and I'm not stepping out until you tell me why. Torres's face twisted, a flash of anger breaking through his composure. I don't give a damn who you are, he spat, his hand now resting on the grip of his gun. The flashlight beam swung wildly as he leaned closer, his silhouette looming in the window. You think that ID means something to me? Get out or I'll make you. The threat hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, and for the first time Schiff felt the weight of real danger. Not the abstract kind he faced in politics, but the kind that came with a loaded weapon and a man who didn't care about consequences. Schiff's fingers tightened on the wheel, not out of fear, but out of focus. He knew he had to stay in control to keep this from spiraling. Officer, you're making a mistake, he said, his voice steady, his gaze unyielding. You're escalating without cause. Let's de-escalate this. Call your supervisor and we'll sort it out. Torres let out a low, humorless chuckle, the sound chilling in its arrogance. The mistake, he said, was thinking you could pull rank on me. And then, before Schiff could respond, Torres reached for the door handle, his fingers curling around it with intent. The click of the handle sent a jolt through Schiff's body. Not fear, not yet, but a sharp awareness that this was no longer a routine stop. His left hand shot out, gripping the inside handle to keep the door shut. Step back, officer, he said, his voice firm, commanding, the kind of tone that had silenced rooms full of hostile witnesses. You're out of line. Torres didn't move. If anything, his grip on the door tightened, his knuckles paling under the strain. I said get out, he growled, his voice raw with the kind of authority that didn't ask for permission. Schiff's mind raced, weighing his options. He could comply, step out and hope Torres didn't push further. but that meant surrendering control, putting himself at the mercy of a man who clearly had none. He could resist, stay in the car, but that risked escalation. And with Torres's hand on his gun, escalation could be deadly. He'd seen the footage, read the stories, people who did everything right and still didn't make it home. His congressional ID, his title, his years of service. They meant nothing to a man like Torres, who saw only a challenge to his power. Schiff's right hand twitched, itching to reach for his phone, but he knew any sudden movement could be misread, twisted into an excuse. "You're crossing a line," he said, his voice low, controlled, but with an edge that carried weight. "You know who I am. You've seen my ID. This isn't worth your career." Torres's lips curled into a smirk, his eyes narrowing. "Career?" he said, almost laughing. "You think you can scare me with that? I'm the law out here." The arrogance in his voice was a spark, igniting something in Schiff. Not anger, but resolve. He'd spent his life fighting for what was right, for the Constitution, for the rule of law. He wasn't about to let a rogue cop rewrite the rules on a deserted highway. But before he could speak, the situation shifted. A faint sound broke through the tension, a rustle, then a voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the night like a lifeline. "Hey, I'm recording this!" The shout came from the side of the road, piercing the suffocating silence. Schiff's eyes flicked to the source, careful not to turn his head. A woman stood there, maybe 30 feet away, her phone raised, the glow of the screen reflecting off her glasses. She was at a safe distance, but close enough for her camera to catch every detail. Torres's gun, his stance, the congressman pinned in his car. "You sure you want to do this, officer?" she called out, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Torres froze, his hand still on the door handle, but the shift in his posture was immediate, a flicker of hesitation, a crack in his armor. He didn't lower his gun, but his eyes darted toward the woman, then back to Schiff, calculating. Schiff seized the moment. "Put the weapon down," he said, his voice stronger now, carrying the weight of authority he had earned over decades. "You're being recorded. This is over." Torres's jaw clenched, his breathing shallow, his mind clearly racing to find a way out. The woman, Maria, Schiff would later learn, kept her phone steady, her voice ringing out again. "I've got it all, officer. The whole world's going to see this." The words were a hammer striking at the foundation of Torres's bravado. For a moment, no one moved, the air thick with the weight of what came next. Schiff's heart pounded, but his face remained calm, his eyes locked on Torres's. He knew this wasn't over, not yet, but the balance had shifted, and for the first time, he felt the faint stirrings of hope that he'd make it through this night. The highway shoulder was a stage now, lit by the harsh glare of headlights and the pulsing red and blue of Torres's cruiser. Adam Schiff stood beside his sedan, his hands still raised, not in surrender, but in a calculated show of restraint. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every sound, the crunch of gravel, the hum of engines, the faint crackle of a police radio, feel like a prelude to chaos. Officer Daniel Torres stood a few feet away, his hand no longer on his gun, but still hovering near his holster, his face a mask of defiance barely concealing the panic creeping into his eyes. Maria, the witness, held her phone steady, its red recording light a silent accusation that kept Torres in check. Her presence had shifted the dynamic, but the danger wasn't gone. Schiff knew it, felt it in the way Torres's jaw twitched, in the way his shoulders stayed rigid, as if he were still weighing whether he could salvage his authority. The congressman's mind was sharp, processing every detail, the angle of Maria's camera, the distance between him and Torres, the faint sound of another siren growing louder in the distance. He'd been in tough spots before, but this was a different kind of battlefield, one where words and evidence were his only weapons. Torres's eyes flicked toward Maria again, his lips curling into a sneer. "Put that damn phone down," he snapped, his voice raw with frustration. But there was a tremor in it now, a crack in the armor of his bravado. Maria didn't flinch. "Not a chance," she shot back, her voice steady, her phone unwavering. "You're not in charge here anymore." The words stung, and Torres's face reddened, his hand twitching toward his belt as if instinct were pulling him toward escalation. Schiff saw it, the moment where a desperate man might double down, and he spoke before Torres could act. "Officer, you're on camera," he said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Every move you make is being recorded. Think about what comes next." Torres's gaze snapped back to Schiff, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't respond. The congressman held his ground, his hands still raised, his posture open but unyielding. He wasn't just a man in a suit anymore. He was a congressman, a public figure, and he knew the weight his title carried, even if Torres refused to acknowledge it. The distant siren grew louder, and within moments, another police cruiser pulled up, its lights sweeping across the scene. The door swung open, and a second officer stepped out. Officer Martinez, a broad-shouldered woman with a face that betrayed no emotion. She strode toward Torres, her eyes flicking between the congressman, the camera, and her partner. "What's going on here?" Martinez asked, her voice low, cautious, as if she were stepping into a minefield. Torres didn't turn to face her, his eyes still locked on Schiff. "Non-compliant driver," he said, the words clipped, rehearsed, as if he'd used them 100 times before to justify his actions. Schiff's jaw tightened. Non-compliant. The phrase was a weapon, one he'd heard in too many reports, seen in too many headlines. It was a code, a way to paint a victim as a threat, to twist the truth before it could take root. But this time, the truth had a witness, and it had a camera. Martinez's gaze shifted to Schiff, and for a fleeting moment, recognition flickered in her eyes. She'd seen the congressman before, on the news, in committee hearings, maybe even at a state event. Her posture stiffened, but she didn't speak, her silence a signal that she was waiting for Torres to lead. Schiff seized the opening. "Officer Martinez," he said, reading the nameplate in the dim light, his voice steady, authoritative. "I'm Congressman Adam Schiff. I was pulled over without cause, threatened with a firearm, and ordered out of my vehicle without explanation. I've complied with every reasonable request, and now I'm asking you to do your job. Detain Officer Torres." The words landed like a gavel, clear and unyielding, and for the first time Torres's composure cracked. "You can't be serious," he spat, taking a step towards Schiff, his hand brushing his holster again. Martinez's arm shot out, stopping her partner mid-step. "Easy," she muttered, her voice low, but there was tension in it, a warning. Maria's voice cut through again, sharp and unrelenting. "It's all on video, officers. The gun, the threats, everything. You want to be on the news tomorrow?" Martinez's eyes darted toward her, then back to Torres, her mind clearly racing. Schiff watched the exchange, his heart steady but his senses on high alert. He knew the power of a camera, the way it could shift a narrative, expose a lie. He also knew the danger of two officers caught in a corner, their careers on the line. Martinez's radio crackled, a dispatcher's voice breaking the silence. "Unit 47, status check." Martinez hesitated, her thumb hovering over the radio. Torres's breathing was shallow now, his eyes darting between Schiff, Maria, and the approaching lights of yet another cruiser. The balance was tipping, and Schiff knew he had to keep the pressure on. "Officer Martinez," he said, his voice softer now, almost conversational, but with an edge that carried weight. "You've got a choice. You can back your partner and go down with him, or you can do what's right. You know who I am. You know this won't end here." Martinez's face was unreadable, but her hand dropped from the radio, a small but significant gesture. Torres saw it, and his anger erupted. "You're not seriously listening to him." "Oh," he snarled, turning on Martinez. "He's just some politician trying to pull rank." Martinez didn't respond, her eyes fixed on Schiff, calculating. The third cruiser screeched to a stop, and two more officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their holsters as they took in the scene. One of them, a sergeant with stripes on his collar, strode forward, his gaze sweeping from Torres's tense stance to Maria's phone to Schiff's raised hands. "Somebody want to explain this?" the sergeant demanded, his voice sharp, authoritative. Schiff didn't hesitate. "Sergeant, I'm Congressman Adam Schiff," he said, lowering his hands slowly, deliberately, reclaiming control of the moment. "Officer Torres pulled me over without cause, threatened me with his weapon, and refused to acknowledge my identification. This woman has it all on video. I want him detained. Now." The sergeant's eyes widened, recognition dawning. He turned to Torres, his expression hardening. "Is that true?" Torres's face twisted, a mix of defiance and desperation. He was non-compliant, he said, his voice weaker now, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. Maria stepped closer, her phone still recording. Non-compliant, she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. He showed you his ID, told you who he was, and you pulled a gun on him. It's all right here. She held up her phone, the screen glowing with the undeniable truth. The sergeant's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting to Martinez, who stood silent, her earlier neutrality now a liability. Cuff him, the sergeant ordered, nodding toward Torres. Martinez hesitated, her loyalty to her partner warring with the reality of the situation. Now, the sergeant snapped, and Martinez moved, pulling out her cuffs with reluctant slowness. Torres's face went pale, his bravado crumbling as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. This is a mistake, he muttered, his voice raw, disbelieving. You're going to regret this. Schiff watched, his expression unreadable, but inside he felt a surge of relief tempered by resolve. This wasn't over. Not for Torres, not for him, not for the system that had let this happen. The sergeant turned to Martinez. You too, he said, his voice cold. Martinez's head snapped up, shock flashing across her face. Sir, I didn't... She started, but the sergeant cut her off. You stood there and let it happen. That's enough. Martinez's shoulders slumped, and she didn't resist as another officer cuffed her. The scene was surreal, the flashing lights casting long shadows across the pavement, Maria's camera capturing every moment, every shift in power. Schiff exhaled slowly, his hands now at his sides, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. He turned to Maria, meeting her gaze. Thank you, he said, his voice quiet but sincere. She nodded, lowering her phone but keeping it ready. Somebody had to, she said, a faint tremor in her voice now that the adrenaline was fading. The sergeant approached Schiff, his expression a mix of respect and unease. Congressman, are you all right? He asked, his tone formal but genuine. Schiff nodded, his eyes still on Torres, who was being led to a cruiser, his head bowed. I'm fine, he said, his voice steady, but this isn't about me. This is about what happens when power goes unchecked. I want internal affairs on this, and I want that video preserved. The sergeant nodded, already pulling out his radio to make the call. As Torres and Martinez were loaded into separate cruisers, Schiff's mind shifted to what came next. This wasn't just a bad stop. It was a symptom of something bigger, something he'd seen in the stories of his constituents, in the letters that crossed his desk. He'd always believed in the rule of law, in the men and women who upheld it, but tonight had shown him how fragile that system could be when the wrong people held the reins. Maria's video was a weapon, one that could expose the truth, but it was only the beginning. The cruisers pulled away, their sirens fading into the night. But Schiff knew the real fight was just starting. He'd make sure Torres faced consequences, not just for him, but for everyone else who'd faced a gun and a badge and didn't have a camera to save them. The morning after the highway incident, the world seemed to shift on its axis. The video Maria had recorded, a grainy but undeniable record of Officer Daniel Torres's aggression in the tense standoff with Congressman Adam Schiff, exploded across social media before the sun had fully risen. By noon, news outlets were replaying the footage on a loop. The image of Torres's hand on his gun, his sneer as he dismissed Schiff's congressional ID, burned into the public's consciousness. Hashtags multiplied, op-eds poured in, and the California Highway Patrol headquarters was swarmed with reporters demanding answers. Schiff sat in his Washington office, a space lined with law books and framed photos from his prosecutorial days. His phone buzzed incessantly on the desk. He ignored it, his eyes fixed on a muted television screen where a pundit dissected the incident, gesturing wildly at a freeze frame of Torres's face. The congressman's expression was unreadable, but his mind was racing, not with anger or vindication, but with a quiet, resolute determination. The night before had been about survival. Today was about accountability, not just for Torres and Officer Martinez, but for a system that had allowed their actions to go unchecked for too long. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, and let the weight of the moment settle. This wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever felt the sting of unchecked power. The fallout was swift. By mid-afternoon, the California Highway Patrol, announced that Torres had been stripped of his badge and charged with assault with a deadly weapon, a felony that carried the weight of years behind bars. Martinez, his silent accomplice, was suspended indefinitely, her role as an enabler under scrutiny by Internal Affairs. The department issued a statement, carefully worded to express regret without admitting systemic failure. But the public wasn't buying it. Protests formed outside the state capitol, signs demanding reform and transparency swaying in the California sun. Schiff watched the coverage from his office, his jaw tight. He'd seen this before. Outrage that flared bright and then faded, buried under bureaucracy or political maneuvering. He wasn't naive. He knew how easy it was for the powerful to wait out a scandal, to let the noise die down until the world moved on. But he also knew he had something they didn't, a platform, a voice, and a responsibility to use both. He picked up his phone not to answer the barrage of calls, but to dial a number he'd saved the night before. Maria's. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious but warm. "Congressman," she said, the faintest hint of surprise in her tone. "I need your help," Schiff said, his voice steady. "This isn't over. Meet me at the community center in Burbank tomorrow night. We're going to talk to people, not just the press, the community." The community center was a low brick building, its walls plastered with flyers for youth programs and voter drives, its parking lot filled with cars by the time Schiff arrived the next evening. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, the kind that comes when people know something bigger than themselves is at stake. The room was packed, mothers with children on their hips, retirees in folding chairs, young activists with notebooks and questions. Maria stood near the front, her phone no longer a weapon but a symbol, a reminder of what one person could do. Schiff stepped to the podium, his suit slightly rumpled from a day of committee hearings, his eyes scanning the crowd. He didn't have a prepared speech, didn't need one. He'd spent his career talking to people, not at them, and tonight he wanted them to feel heard. "Good evening," he began, his voice carrying the same steady cadence that had calmed the highway standoff. "I'm here because of what happened 2 nights ago, but I'm also here because of what's happened too many times before that. What happened to me wasn't new. It was just caught on camera." A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads nodding, some faces tight with the kind of pain that comes from lived experience. Schiff paused, letting the room settle. "I'm a congressman," he continued, "but that night I was just a man on a road, facing a gun and a badge. If it wasn't for Maria," he gestured toward her, and the room erupted in applause. "I might not be standing here, but here's the truth. Most folks don't have a camera or a title or a way to make the world listen. And that's why we're here, to make sure they do." He spoke for 10 minutes, not about himself, but about the letters he'd received over the years. Stories of traffic stops gone wrong, of families torn apart by a system that too often protected its own. He didn't sugarcoat the challenges, didn't promise easy fixes, but he laid out a plan, a push for mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, and stricter penalties for officers who abuse their power. The crowd listened, some taking notes, others whispering to neighbors, a shared sense of purpose growing with every word. When Maria took the microphone, the room went quiet. She wasn't a politician, wasn't used to speaking to crowds, but her voice was steady, raw with the weight of what she'd seen. "I was scared that night," she admitted, her hands gripping the podium. "I thought about driving past, minding my own business. But I couldn't because if we all look away, nothing changes." She told her story, not just the video, but why she'd stopped, why she'd raised her phone. She talked about her nephew, pulled over years ago, humiliated for no reason, his story buried because no one was there to record it. "This isn't about one congressman or one cop," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "It's about all of us. We've got to hold the line, not just when it's on the news, but every day." The applause was deafening, a release of frustration and hope, and Schiff felt something shift inside him. A recognition that this moment, this room, was the real battleground. The meeting stretched into the night, questions and stories pouring out. A mother spoke of her son, arrested on flimsy charges, his life derailed. A retired officer admitted to seeing colleagues cross lines, his silence a regret he carried. Schiff listened, answered when he could, promised to carry their voices to Washington. By the time the room emptied, he and Maria stood alone, the weight of the evening settling around them. "You meant what you said," Maria said, not a question, but a statement, "about making this bigger than you." Schiff nodded, his eyes distant but resolute. "I've got a vote and a voice. If I don't use them now, what's the point?" She smiled, just a flicker, and handed him a flash drive. "The video," she said, "use it. Pause it, show them what's at stake." Back in his office the next day, Schiff met with aides, drafting letters to the Justice Department and state officials, demanding a federal review of police training and disciplinary processes. He called for public hearings, not in Washington, but in communities like Burbank, where the people most affected could speak. The video, now verified and released with Maria's permission, became a catalyst, not just for outrage, but for action. Lawmakers who'd stayed silent began to speak up, wary of the public's growing demand for change. Schiff didn't stop there. He reached out to advocacy groups, sat with families who'd lost loved ones to police misconduct, and pushed for legislation that would tie federal funding to police reform. It wasn't glamorous work. Bills moved slowly, compromises diluted ideals, but it was real, and he knew real change took time. The lesson of that night on the highway wasn't just about Torres's cuffs or Martinez's suspension. It was about responsibility, the kind that starts with one person choosing to act, whether it's raising a phone or raising a voice. Schiff learned it from Maria, from the crowd at the community center, from the stories that poured in after the video went viral. Justice wasn't a moment, it was a movement, built on the courage of ordinary people who refused to look away. For the people listening to this story, the message was clear. You don't need a title to make a difference. Speak up, show up, hold the powerful accountable. The system isn't perfect, but it bends when enough hands push. Schiff knew he couldn't fix it alone, but he could start where he stood, and so could anyone else. As he prepared for the next fight, a stack of letters from constituents on his desk, he felt a quiet hope, not in victory, but in the work itself, in the people who'd carry it forward long after the headlines faded.